I'm Maggie Butt, and I'm going to be talking now about genre, about working as a poet, in which case I am called Maggie Butt, and also working as a novelist, in which case I'm called Maggie Brookes, and I will explain those two names in a moment as well. What it actually means to be a published poet, first of all, because I have 6 collections. And I've published very widely in magazines. But in case anybody is wondering, that doesn't mean that you make any money out of it. There are very few poets who can make a living. Maybe Simon Armitage, Carol Ann Duffy, those sorts of people. You will find university departments chock full of poets who are teaching to supplement their poetry income because it is very little. We are a very small world, the poetry world. We operate in many ways because there are different types of poetry, so many different types of poetry, from spoken word and rap through to much more esoteric written material. And we have our high days and our holidays and our Oscars, which is the T.S. Eliot Awards, and our national magazine, which is Poetry Review. But there are also hundreds of small magazines, and there's lots of opportunity for publication, but there isn't much money in it. So I'm going to go on to talk about becoming a novelist. And I had always written prose as well as poetry, but since about 2000 I had been publishing poetry really quite widely, and then in 2007 or 8 I met a chap at my mum's sheltered accommodation. We were going up in the lift together, and he said, "I bet I could tell you a story about the war that would make your hair stand on end." And the journalist in me was immediately hooked, so I kind of whistled him out of the lift and onto the corridor outside and said, tell me more. And what he said to me was that he had been a British prisoner of war and had been in a Nazi prison camp when 2 escaped prisoners were brought back in. And when the guards had gone away, one of the prisoners asked for quiet in the hut and said, "I've got something to tell you all. This isn't another escaped British prisoner at all. This is my Czech wife." And there was uproar in the hut, the people banging their tin cups and shouting, because there was a woman in the camp. And he went on to tell me that they had then guarded this woman, and she had remained in the camp for 6 months, having to keep completely silent, having to cope with her period, having to cope with being in a hut with 100-odd men, having the Nazi guards looking at her all the time. And I was fascinated. He was mostly interested in how good they'd been in caring for her and protecting her, and I was really interested in what on earth was that like for a woman. And so I began to write it, because I'm a writer and that's what I do. And for some reason it came out as a long narrative poem. Well, you know, I'm a poet, I love poetry, but the words long narrative poem do send a sort of arrow of dread into my heart. So the fact that I ended up writing one was a little bit of a surprise to me. And then, of course, I had to find someone who would publish it, and found there's a wonderful poetry webzine called Snakeskin, where he published it as an e-chapbook. And a very dear friend of mine who has a recording studio recorded me reading it. So they put an MP3 as well as a downloadable e-chapbook on the website. And at that point, I had developed the characters to some extent. I had developed the narrative arc to some extent, but obviously it's a reasonably short thing. And I thought I was done with it, and I moved on to my next collection of poetry, which was Ali Pali Prison Camp, and then another collection of poetry, Degrees of Twilight. So I thought I'd left this behind, the story that Sidney Reed told me about. And then I thought, do you know what? That was such a good story. That was probably the best story I'm ever going to be given in my life. And shouldn't I try to write it in a way that gives it to more people, shares it with more people? Because I think what we're wanting to do, a lot of what we're wanting to do as writer, is share, isn't it? Share our experience, share our imagination. So then I began to research it as a novel. I went to the usual places, of course, the National Archive at Kew, the Imperial War Museum, I did a lot of online research. There's some fantastic resources. I discovered, I knew quite a lot already. My dad had been a prisoner of war, and I knew quite a lot about the way that prisoners of war were put into work camps. So I already knew about that. Although my father never spoke about his experience, not one word about it. And perhaps part of my writing was trying to find out what he had experienced. I went to the British Museum. I read lots and lots of books. I then thought, and then I discovered that the Czech woman and her British husband would have had to go on something called the Long March, which I'd never heard of. And basically this was as the Red Army was sweeping in from the east. All of the people who were in Eastern European prison camps were evacuated overnight in January 1949 during terrible blizzard conditions, and they were evacuated ahead of the Red Army so that they wouldn't go back and join the fight on their side. And they had to walk 500 miles across Poland, what's now Poland, and Germany, a most harrowing and excruciating march, and many people died. And when I found out about that, I thought, oh, I don't know if I can write this. I thought, well, maybe if I went there, then I would see whether I could write it. So I'm going to talk a bit in the last section of this about when I'm talking about writing place. I'm going to talk about where I went. So I will gloss over that a little bit now. And then eventually I sat down and started writing, and I got to a point where I had a full draft, and then I got my Writers and Artists yearbook, and I looked for publishers of historical fiction, and I started to send it out. And I sent this book, or versions of it, to 20 agents who rejected it. I sent it to some who didn't reply at all. I sent it to some who very annoyingly wrote things like, there are some excellent chapters, but didn't tell me which. And then I eventually sent it to, and one or two sent me back quite detailed suggestions for improvements, which I incorporated, and then finally sent it to the woman who is now my utterly wonderful agent, and I love her to bits. And she very quickly sold it for an astonishing amount of money, to my mind, to an imprint of Penguin Random House, who then sold it on to America, Holland, Italy, Spain, Poland, Hungary, Sri Lanka, anyway, lots of places. And what I'm going to do is just read you the prologue, as Josie has already mentioned that. Everything was quiet and still, apart from the light crunch of our boots as we crept down the deserted street. The sliver of moon disappeared behind a cloud, and we slowed our pace, barely able to make out the way ahead. That was when we heard the dogs. Only one bark at first, carrying in the quiet of the night. We clutched each other's hands and stood still for a moment. Then another bark, Then another, not muffled by the walls of a building, but out in the night, like us, out on the street. Instinctively, we moved away from the sound, and the buildings glowered at us, closing in. My heart was drumming and my breath came fast. We walked more quickly. The dogs were barking, closer, echoing off the buildings, perhaps 2 of them, perhaps 3. We turned to see if they were in sight, but the darkness was too absolute. We were acutely aware of the noise of our boots on the cobbled road. And then there were shouts behind us, men's voices, excited to have something to do in the boredom of the night watch, egging on the dogs, eager for the hunt. Whichever way we turned, the dogs and men grew closer, and our boots clanged louder. It became a town of sounds. Our breath, the pounding of our own blood in our ears, the clatter of our boots on the road, the dogs barking, men running and calling, closer, closer. Perhaps we could have stopped, knocked on a door and begged for help, but we didn't. We just kept going, faster and faster, running, Bill dragging me with him. I was breathless to keep up, my kit bag banging awkwardly against my legs. At last there was an opening in the terrace, an archway leading to a narrow arcade lined with dark shops. Towards the end of the alley was an even darker place that looked like another turning, but it was only a wide doorway up 2 steps, set back and hidden until we drew level with it. Now the dogs were almost upon us, and Bill pulled me up into the doorway, threw his arms around me, squeezed me very hard, and whispered, "I'm so sorry," into my hair. Then he pushed me away from him so we wouldn't be found touching. I shut my eyes and waited for the dog's teeth, hoped it would be over quickly. I was told by my publisher that this was a commercial novel. Who knew? I was just writing a story. I had no idea what the difference really was between a commercial novel and a literary novel. But the things that she had me do were partly to make it more commercial and less literary. So my title had always been The Girl Made of Silence, and I still rather love that title, but they thought The Prisoner's Wife gave a much clearer idea of what it was about. I was advised to completely change the structure. I had had it beginning at this point where they're captured and then going forward, and at the same time telling the story of how they met in flashback. But my editor wanted it to be chronological, so I unpicked the structure. She also wanted there to be chapters from Bill's point of view, so that it wasn't all in the voice of Izzy, my Czech woman. And again, I stomped around the house and thought, I can't do that. I don't want to do that. This is supposed to be her story. And then the next day I woke up with an idea of how I could do Bill's voice as well. So that's what it has. And it came out in the UK as The Prisoner's Wife. And you can see the difference in the covers. This is the US cover and the UK cover. And on the wall behind me is the very beautiful Dutch cover.